Hey everyone, happy Friday and welcome to the Wilder Ride. Before we start the show, wanted to remind everybody that we do have a way of financially supporting what we're doing, and that is via our Patreon page at patreon.com/the Wilder Ride. And so it goes without saying, we owe some people a thank you. Let's start off with Tara Bain, who has been with us from the very beginning, our very first patron, a stalwart supporter of the Wilder Ride. Thank you, Tara. We have 2 executive producers we need to give top billing to next. That includes Wendy Muller, who joined us last season and has been a stalwart supporter. Thank you, Wendy, for all of your support and your activity in the listeners group. And to Ross Seymour, a golden ticket subscriber. You get executive producer credit as well. Ben Forty Ford, from across the pond, a member of the podcast team of 60 Minutes With, a podcast everyone should be subscribing and listening to. Doug Greenberg, one of the hosts of the Rocky Minute, also a podcast you guys should be subscribing to. Doug, thank you so much. Off the Bounce, the basketball podcast. Thanks, Coach Peacock. We appreciate your support. A big shout out to Jeff Lieboff, one of the hosts of Radio Labyrinth, a podcast you guys should be following. Keep in mind, though, not safe for work. Also, a big thank you to Professor Robert E.G. Black, a podcaster himself, part of the Movies by Minutes family. He did the show Dave Made a Minute and Michael Myers Minute, also in the midst of the Room Minute. Yours truly, along with Walt, were both on Dave Made a Minute, and I was on the Michael Myers Minute. So thank you, Robert, for being a supporter. Melissa Moody, we appreciate your support being out there, and Rob Smithers. You guys are fantastic. It takes a lot to put on a show like this. If you'd like to be a supporter, please join our Patreon group. It starts as little as $1 a month. So let's get to it. Before we waste any more of your time, let's welcome to the stage Gene Wilder.
Inside this room, all of my dreams become realities, and some of my realities become dreams.
What in the wide, wide world of sports is going on here? Alive! It's alive! It's alive!
You are listening to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute. Here are your hosts, Alan Sanders and Walt Murray.
Hey everyone, welcome back to The Wilder Ride, getting wilder by the minute, a podcast that celebrates the films of Gene Wilder 1 minute at a time. Happy Friday to you. This season, we are diving into Blazing Saddles 1. You do it for Randolph Scott, minute at a time. I'm your host, I'm Alan Sanders.
I'm your co-host, Randolph Scott. I'm your co-host, Walt Murray.
And joining us from the wasteland, from the Fury Road itself, one of the 2 podcasters from the Mad Max Minute, we've got Rick Ingham. Rick, welcome.
Hello, Walt. Hello, Alan. Oh, what a day. What a lovely Friday.
Lovely, lovely Friday. At least we have the weekend to look forward to, right?
Absolutely.
I know we initially had your wife also scheduled to join us. The 2 of you joined us last season for Young Frankenstein. But, you know, schedules happen, things happen,
Exactly.
Life happens. Maybe we'll be able to catch her next time.
Yeah, she's up in the penthouse at Bartertown. She had someone come in at a last-minute appointment, so she's got something that she's working out. We're hoping it works out well because, there's this guy giving us trouble, and she's going to interview this guy. Hopefully he passes the audition, and he can take care of that little problem we have.
Well, at least she's not still stuck up in the Citadel's main chamber.
Exactly.
All right. Well, we are going to dive into minute 70 today, and we have kind of a lineup today. We start off with a bunch of folks already ready to leave town. That's where we left off yesterday. And we actually have Olson Johnson say, read this, and we're going to end with another line, this time a line of what looks like Desperados. But as we do often when we bring on a new guest, and this is the second time you've joined us from last season to this season, first time this season, Rick, I always like to ask, what are your recollections of Blazing Saddles, especially, growing up, and do you remember when you first saw it?
Well, I think remember is probably the best word to start off by saying, because I have a terrible memory, but at the risk of repeating myself from when we were on Young Frankenstein, my first exposure to Mel Brooks in general was when my buddy Jeff suggested that we watch Spaceballs for my birthday party, and then he was mortified when the princess uses the phrase son of a bitch when she's shot in the hair. And so that kind of was my first exposure. And then later on in high school, I'm pretty sure it was my buddy Kyle when I was over at his house, because his parents cared less about what we watched. And that's where we first watched Blazing Saddles. And I know that there are some people that have favorites, one Mel Brooks movie to the other, but Blazing Saddles from the first time I watched it eclipsed Spaceballs almost immediately.
And I didn't know if Walt was going to jump in on that, but looking back then, because you said, with some of these remembrances, at what point did this become maybe more of a consistent rewatching in your rotation? We all have that shelf of movies we go to when we can't think of anything else to watch. So where would it fall in that respect?
I can't necessarily say that I'm a normal, or I can't necessarily say that I watch a lot of movies very often, but this one does that lovely thing where it Venn diagrams over the different genres that I'm sure you've pointed out. If I want to watch a Western, yeah, I could just call up on YouTube and watch an old Randolph Scott movie for free. But I mean, I have a copy of Blazing Saddles, and if I feel like, I just want to watch something with horses and cowboys, boom, Blazing Saddles is the first one I think of. It's an easy choice for me.
Is that because of the comedy aspects of it, or something else?
Oh, absolutely the comedy. Like, Westerns are great for a lot of things, for the action and the sincerity of the actors and the setting and whatnot. But when you've got the main characters that you've got in this movie, it's an easy choice, really.
All right, well, let me ask you this then, because one of the big things about the movie, and, obviously 45 years ago is when it came out, it was dealing with, or at least tackling the idea of racism. Mm-hmm. And Gene Wilder is famously quoted as saying, this movie punches racism in the face, but does it while it makes you laugh. So what are your thoughts about the social commentary behind the movie Blazing Saddles?
Well, I'm definitely a fan of racists being punched in the face there. And so any opportunity to see that couched in a genre that you normally assume, this is obviously filled with terrible people anyway. So it's just, if there's a guy out there that thinks a lot of the things that the antagonist in this movie thinks genuinely, and then he sees that lampooned on screen, it just makes me so glad, because I am staunchly a northerner. I know you guys are down there south of the line, but, any chance for me to pull out my old Union blues?
Well, I was born in Detroit. I just happen to be a transplant.
Well, I'm a southerner, but
you got to talk to Walt there. He's the south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah, Walt was telling me about how hard it is for him in the wintertime with highs of 50 degrees and how it gets so cold sometimes things will actually freeze. And I'm like, oh, you poor summer child.
I got to go out there and
I spent
and refill a dog bowl.
I spent 9 years in Ohio, so I do I have had my share of winters, and I just when it gets up over 90, I'm done. I'm ready for some cooler weather. So I'm kind of an odd southerner in that way, and of course I'm walking around my Boston Bruins hat today because they just made the playoffs. So,
well, I spent 2 years in Nevada. And so I got a taste of what it feels like for it to be 120 degrees out in direct sunlight, and then you step into the shade and it suddenly drops 10, 15 degrees. And I'm like, what is this dry, arid climate? What is this? Where's all the humidity?
Yeah, you have zero humidity out there. So the good thing here is we get to walk around in a blanket of humidity all year long. So
just about nonstop.
Makes it a lot more fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think the South still does get a little bit of a bad rap on racism, because I've been to other parts of the country where racism is worse than it is here in Atlanta, and I think Atlanta is a bit of a melting pot, though, because you do have people from all over the country and all over the world. So,
I live 40 minutes north of Boston, and if you want to talk about racist cities, they don't want to admit it, but I mean, Boston is pretty bad.
And I've said this before because I've got some friends of mine who were like, at least you didn't grow up in the South. I'm like, do you have any idea what it was like or what we used to do in Detroit? I mean, apparently they thought race riots was a pastime in the 60s. I mean, we even came up with the idea of Devil's Night, where we would go out and egg people's houses the night before Halloween. It wasn't exactly civilized.
Yeah, and when I grew up here, I went to high school in a school that wasn't, it was probably 20% minority, but everybody kind of treated each other the same. We never had, I mean, I don't remember one time in all my years of middle school and high school where there was ever a racial problem in our schools. So it's funny when I hear people from other parts of the country talk about the racial issues they had there. Now, I have been to towns, in Mississippi and stuff like that where it's still a problem, but you just don't see it like it's often portrayed.
Well, I think to argue that we're still the same would be ridiculous. We have definitely shown huge improvements since the civil rights era. There's always room to continue to improve. And that's the reason we decided to dive into this movie for our second title. And hearkening back to our first season, Rick, with you and Julia, when you asked us when did you think we would do Blazing Saddles, and I said at that time I wanted to put it off for a couple of seasons because it is, there's a lot of words in here that can trigger people, and it might make people shut down and stop listening. And the more we thought about it after finishing Young Frankenstein, I said, we need to go into this movie because, if you miss what's happening in the story because you're so easily triggered by a word, then you're missing a huge anti-racism movie.
Absolutely.
And I think today we need to sort of, take a step back and realize everything has a context. And before you just start to make an immediate judgment, you kind of need to know a little bit more about what's happening on the screen. And so far, I think, Walt, we're both pleasantly surprised. Although we both agree there are certain words you shouldn't use in your everyday vernacular. There's a lot of bigotry that's still out there. This movie seems to be universally loved by every one of the guests we brought on, and almost every one of the guests that we brought on seems to understand that you have to portray the bad guys using the bad language, otherwise you're softening what you're trying to fight against.
Yeah, I keep waiting for that person, and even talking to my friends and folks about what we're doing, I haven't had anybody step up and say, oh, I hate that movie, it's so terrible, and whatever. But every single person I talk to is like, oh, they couldn't make that movie today. And that comes up all the time. So it is a weird dichotomy with this movie that everybody seems to love it and appreciate it for what it is, but can't see how it could possibly be made today.
I mean, not to belabor the point, but I think it just stems back to reactionary culture. Nobody wants to read the story. They only want to react to the headline.
And I think until we can maybe move past that, you can't imagine this movie, and I don't want to say made today because I don't want to make it remade, and I don't think you would ever remake, but I think it is right that there's just too much of a reaction by those people who are instantly triggered by certain words, or people who are sort of like, I don't want anyone to think that this is funny, so I'm going to pretend I don't like it. It's almost like, it's like we're not being true to ourselves. We're all sort of living in this hyper, I better be really, really careful about how I project myself or how I acknowledge myself or what I think is funny. I know a lot of comedians are having a hard time playing tours to younger audiences because they're saying, wait a minute, I'm telling jokes for a reason, but a bunch of them are shutting down.
Well, I hear a lot of comedians say they won't even go to college campuses anymore. And
well, yeah, if comedy was easy, everybody would do it.
Oh, yeah. Well, and I think that they are acknowledging and realizing that a lot of people don't understand what comedy is, and they basically get riled up over small things. When I was in college, I do remember we had a big KSU day or something where all these comedians and entertainers came to campus, and it was basically like a big field day. And Carrot Top got booed off the stage, and it wasn't because of anything racial. It was because he was not very good.
Well, that's when you should be moved. When you suck.
Carrot Top is when you should be moved off stage.
Yeah, he does, and I'm not really sure what that is, but you're right. But the other comedians, we probably had 10 other people perform that day and had a pretty good reception. But I don't think those same people could come. Maybe Carrot Top could get away with his stuff now, but anybody else who's really kind of observing culture and building their comedy off of that, I think would have a very difficult time today.
Well, I think it all depends on the comic. I think people have heard the same demographic of comic comment on the same things for so long that people are, in a sense, thirsty for something new. So I think those new comics that are looking at the old greats and seeing what they did and say, oh, I'll just parrot what the greats did. It's like, no, you got to find your own thing. You've got to adapt and change with the times because, comedy is an ever evolving thing. Comedy is not static. And I think now here I am waxing philosophical about comedy as a guy who is the straight man in most of the podcast projects that I work on. I think with comedy, you have to be able to use the structure of, expectation and upsetting those expectations, but doing it in such a way that it doesn't alienate. Like, it's a science. When I said if it was easy, everybody would do it, I wasn't lying. It's a craft. And I think a lot of people go into it thinking, oh, you just tell a couple of jokes and people are going to laugh and then they throw money and women at you. But no, it's a craft. It's something that needs to be honed and tested. And I think a lot of people these days, they think it's just so easy because they jump on Twitter, they crack a couple of jokes and get a few likes, and then they think they can jump up on stage. But not to actually craft something, to do what Mel Brooks does and build a world around a joke and then execute it effectively, that's difficult.
Well, one comedian that I was listening to on a podcast not long ago said that if you are going to be successful in comedy, you actually have to sit down and write 3 to 5 jokes per day. And you think about doing that and then going on stage 4, 5, 6 times a week. That is a lot of hard work. And then you throw in travel and good audience and bad audience and all the other stuff that goes with it. It is a very difficult job.
It reminds me of, I used to be a huge Dennis Leary fan, especially when he was coming up in his early comedy, and he had written a book called No Cure for Cancer, talking about one of his first comedy tours. He said, looking back, a lot of the stuff he was doing, he'd find himself, writhing around on the stage, trying out new material, and he'd look out and realize there's not a peep from the audience, and he'd say to himself, I don't know if any of this is working. And he said that was the hardest part about battling through the material and deciding what worked and what didn't. And the only way is you have to go in front of the audience. I mean, it's great to think it's funny all by yourself, but unless you're in front of a crowd, that's the true testing ground.
Yeah, it really is. And that is a very unique skill to be able to do that.
Think of how hard that is, to be in front of an audience and you think you've got all this funny stuff and no one's responding. That's hard. Bombing in front of a group of people. Now, I can't say that I know what that's like, but I know some who have. I've read about it.
I've been there. I've tried my hand at stand up a couple times, and once went fine, and the other one was it was not fine.
Oh, it went off the rails.
Why I'm doing podcasts.
Yeah, well, I can edit out the stuff.
Oh, off the rails wouldn't even. Yeah, that's right. Or leave it in to make people laugh at me, but at least I'm getting laughs.
All right, well then, before we dive into this minute, because we're sort of reflecting on comedy and the state of comedy, especially as it relates to this movie, Rick, as far as this movie, when it comes to rewatchability, you said it's not huge on rewatchability on your list, but in terms of funny movies, where does it fall for you? Is it in your top 10? Sort of I recognize it as an important movie, but I don't laugh at it as much as when I was a kid. Is it as fresh and funny today as it was? Where does it fall?
Oh, it's still fresh and funny as it is, or as it was when I first watched it. As I mentioned earlier, like the craft that went into this is evergreen in my eyes, because it's just my aesthetic. It's that sarcastic and yet sincere and yet poking fun and exposing thing. It hits so many bases in my personal ball field that it's always going to work for me.
Awesome.
Even the sophomoric farting scenes.
I would say especially the sophomore farting scenes.
Hey, it made our friend Burton Gilliam famous, as Mel Brooks said. I'm going to make you famous today. You're going to do something that's never been done on American screen before. So, well, let's go ahead and dive into this minute, because Walt, when we last left yesterday, Sheriff Bart and the Waco Kid were coming back from having confronted the folks over at the railroad, and they see the entire town looks basically packed up and ready to go. And it starts off with, hey, where are you all going? That was yesterday. And Olson Johnson stands up and grabs the sheet of paper and says,
Read this.
Now, this seems to be a bit of a pared down version of the list compared to what we went over yesterday, Walt.
Well, it does. It is a good summary, though. I mean, they kind of
It is.
hit the broad strokes on it. So, I mean, heartless villains for destruction of Rockridge.
Yeah, that sounds like the kind of phrase that Hedley would use to basically encapsulate everything he had just said once Taggart finally found that pen.
It works because obviously who's going to reread it? But I think it would have been funny if it had looked like microprint and had been able to see, like rustlers, cutthroats, pugs, thugs, mugs, nitwits, halfwits, dimwits. I mean, the whole list. But instead it's, and we got to remember, Taggart couldn't find his paper and pencil. So he said, could you please
he just
repeat
got the
that?
summary out there. Well, I love on here.
Just heartless villains. How about that?
Well, I love that it's criminal record required and equal opportunity employer. I mean, as someone who does background checks for a living for people's businesses, this is one of my favorite things. I'm going to have to find a copy of this poster and hang it in my office.
Did you guys look up how much $100 a day would equal in 1974?
In 1974 or 1874?
Well, obviously this is 1874 and they're paying $100 a day. And I'm like, okay, so when this movie came out, how much would that have equaled for the viewers? And so I went on the inflation calculator. $100 in 1874, 100 years later would have been equivalent to $432 a day.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you want to bring that out to 2019 money, that would be the equivalent of walking into a place and seeing a poster saying that you're going to go in and destroy this town and get paid over $2,200 a day.
Right. And if you were to convert from 1874 to 2018 or 2019, it'd be $2,202.69.
Yeah. I mean, if someone was going to give me $2,200 in a single day and I needed a criminal record, I don't know, I'd probably go punch a police horse just to get a criminal record so I could turn around and get paid that much money in a single day.
Well, and the good thing is,
that's a lot of money.
If you go do a good job, there's going to be more work for you in the area.
Yeah.
Right.
If you get a resume that has Hedley Lamarr's name on it, you could take that elsewhere. Hey, I've already been a government employee once. Why not again?
Yeah, and there's always...
I think that's the funny part to me. Hedley Lamarr is not afraid to put his name at the bottom of the page. I mean, he's the Attorney General, the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the territory, I mean,
if anything, he should have a book of all the people with criminal records. He could go and pick these guys.
He's already got Boris downstairs, saying, can you pull out the guys from the line that are the worst of the worst? I need to come talk to them.
I wonder, is there a section in like monster.com for stuff like this where you go in and, help wanted, mugs, pugs, thugs, buggerers, Methodists.
Buggerers.
Must have criminal record.
Yeah, you got to put it in the keyword section.
We need the appropriate tags in your posting so people can find you on the internet.
Exactly. People always wonder, why aren't I getting hired? It's because you haven't filled out your tag section.
The only thing I thought that would be better on this poster is if it had said Hedley Lamarr and then crossed out and said Hedley.
That would have been great. I mean, like, whoever who's taking down the note. Hey, Lamarr, that's Hedley. Could have been crossed out over the side. That's Hedley.
I think that's the only thing.
Just like a big rubber stamp.
Now, I want to play an opposite thing here because it's equally funny to me here because, Walt, we've seen this happen in our current society, in current day. Police officers using Facebook posts to lure criminals in, to turn themselves in. Like, hey, we found out that there's a bunch of methamphetamine that might be infected with, let's say, some biological disease or something, and we need to have it tested. And then you find people who who turn themselves in to have their drugs tested. I mean, if I'm a desperado or a nasty guy and the attorney general wants me to show up with my criminal resume, I'm thinking I'm about to get entrapped.
But this thing is as old as time. When my dad was working in law enforcement, they pulled something like this. And, hey, come in. I can't remember what they did, but it was a joint thing between the FBI and local law enforcement. And they ended up arresting like 35 people with warrants.
Yeah. I mean, this happens a lot where law enforcement kind of puts it out there just to see, because let's face it, a lot of criminals aren't exactly the brightest of individuals. I mean, otherwise they wouldn't get caught.
Yeah. Too many paint chips as a child.
Is this lead paint okay? Sure. Just keep chewing. But obviously for the town of Rockridge, this does freak them out. And I mean, this is not the first time that Bart's come across Hedley Lamarr. I mean, why would a high roller like Hedley Lamarr? Why is he interested in a town like Rockridge? I mean, I don't know why I don't even know if he's figured it out except for where the railroad's going. But by the time they just figured out that that's where the railroad's going a few minutes ago, that's where all of Taggart's men showed up. And then, of course, the Waco kids saved them. But we never really got to the bottom of why they were there. Yet Hedley Lamarr's name keeps coming up.
Hedley Lamarr's name comes up all the time for everything, it seems like.
I mean, he's got a singing Bavarian bombshell on retainer that he sends from town to town. He's obviously in charge of Taggart's men. He's just put out a bounty for all these other criminals to show up. And I mean, at some point, doesn't that warrant maybe an investigation?
Well, since he's the investigator and
there's no oversight here.
There's zero oversight. And apparently the governor's not the sharpest tool.
No, we just say he's a tool.
Yeah, but he's not sharp.
Well, he is not a sharp tool.
I guess it just goes back to what we were saying many minutes ago now, when we watched that really Hedley does seem to be in charge. I mean, he helps the governor sign his own name. Even though he's the attorney general, it's almost like he's the real person in charge, and Lepedemain is just sort of like a figurehead.
Yeah, Lepedemain is nothing but a puppet.
Well, we've had, as we continue on with the dialogue, Sheriff Bart says,
Well, can't you see that's the last act of a desperate man?
I love this line returning to him from Howard Johnson.
We don't care if it's the first act of Henry V. We're leaving.
You know, as if the sheriff had been quoting a play.
Well, if he's quoting, he's really picking the wrong section, because you don't want to start with the first act of Henry V. You want to go with the fourth act. I think it's like third scene of Henry V. Because that's the St. Crispin's Day speech. That would get people going.
But he says, don't you see it's the last act of a desperate man? But at the very beginning of Henry V, the church thinks they're going to manipulate Hal because they think he's still kind of just a kid at heart. The French think he's going to be pushed over. I mean, they send him a box of tennis balls to go play with, but he ends up, being serious. And so it's kind of an interesting thing because everyone at the beginning of Henry V, they don't have any expectation that Hal's ever going to fight back, that he's a kid to be pushed around. And it turns out Bart, like you said, he's more like the Hal of later in the play. That's like, we happy few, we band of brothers. I mean, I love how he just calls out Henry V because I'm a Shakespeare fan, but the play on words, from the last act of a desperate man, as if that's the name of the play, and well, I don't care if it's the first act of Henry V. We're leaving.
It is a great line. And it is one of the more memorable lines from the movie, but it is just well written and perfectly executed.
I think so. And because it's one of those things that we talked about this several times already, the kind of comedy in this, that's one of those ones where you kind of have to be aware of a play being referenced, but he's turning the words sort of, on itself and, comparing the last act of a desperate man as if the last, the desperation of a man, and then the act as if that's the act in a play. Even as a kid, hearing the use of those words, but applying them in a different way because it applies to a play, it always struck me as just really good comedy writing.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's one of the best crafted jokes in the movie.
Yeah.
And you'll get no argument from me.
Now he does start to wait a minute.
No, wait a minute. Wait just one doggone minute here. Just give me 24 hours to come up with a brilliant idea to save our town. Just 24 hours. That's all I ask.
I love that. But they all say no initially. No! And before he quotes the next line, which we'll get to, at what point has Bart let them down yet? I mean, why aren't they going to believe him just on his own word?
I'm guessing it's just because he's so new. Like, he's not a local. Like, yeah, he's come through for them in the clutch a couple of times. Like, no one ever thought he could beat Mongo. And no one ever thought that he'd be able to actually exist longer than a day. But even so, like, they've known him for what? A couple weeks, maybe, if I'm being, generous here.
Yeah, I mean, depending on the timeline, it could only be 3 days.
Well, and once they've made up their mind, it's hard to get people, particularly a group of people, to change their mind back. And for them, they feel threatened. They feel like their way of life is being destroyed and that there's really no hope. And Bart has proven himself a couple times, but I mean, still, this is their whole life and livelihood. And, they're not willing to take that gamble yet.
I almost wonder if this is painting that portrait of, here's all these people that think they're better than everyone else, and yet they're still willing to run and hide like cowards instead of fight. And, it kind of flies in the face of Olson Johnson's earlier speech about, when they were in the church, about remember how our forefathers, fought all the way across the country, and we're not about to give up our town now. Well, as soon as the poster comes out, that's really all it took.
Well, they are very fickle. I mean, they've been kind of all over the place. I mean, they blow like the wind. And when the, even when the pastor, Reverend Johnson, is up there, he gives that speech and he says, okay, I'm out of here. And so they really have no real moral bearing on this. They just do what they feel like doing.
But you could also understand why they're so frightened. I mean, they were thinking about turning tail and run after the initial whirlwind of bad guys blew through their town, and they were able to stick it out because Sheriff Bart showed up. But this is the promise of a greater wind blowing through town with an even more destructive force. And yeah, they were technically able to survive the first go-around, but they really don't want to have to live through the second rope. So I can understand why they want to leave. Absolutely understand, but it definitely doesn't speak to all of the grand motions that they were making back in the church before that bomb flew through the window.
Well, he does turn around and say, well, okay, fine.
You do it for Randolph Scott.
You're goddamn right.
Even being a kid, having no idea who Randolph Scott was, it was always funny to me when the choir kicks in. Randolph Scott! Randolph Scott! Because it's like, Randolph Scott, and the Randolph Scott, and then here comes that choir. Always funny to me. And of course now, being older, I understand that this is one of those, I mean, this guy was one of the leading men of, early Westerns, like one of the original leading men.
So once I was invited to be on this show, I thought it would be fun to go out and watch some Randolph Scott movies. And admittedly, I mean, I've watched less than 1% of the movies that he's put out. I was only able to watch 3 out of 103. But I watched Gunfighters from 1947, Albuquerque from 1948, and Man in the Saddle from 1951. And just based on those movies alone, I would do anything for Randolph Scott.
Yeah, he was amazing. He was, and he was like the perfect cowboy. And I think even up through probably, the 40s and 50s, maybe even later than that, he was probably the biggest name in cowboy movies, or at least one of the biggest.
Yeah, I mean, he was 6'2.5", described as lanky and handsome, soft-going, easy, charming, with a southern drawl in his early films that would help offset some of his limitations as a younger, when he came across as either stiff or lumbering. And Scott's acting improved as he became a little more burnished and leathery, turning him more into that strong, silent type. I mean, I guess he was Clint Eastwood before there was Clint Eastwood.
Oh, yeah. I would say he has more charm than Clint Eastwood.
Oh, yeah, probably as far as the way it comes across, much more easygoing, where Clint probably looks a little tougher, more menacing.
Yeah.
But still, the idea of being that quiet but leathery, just that, oh my gosh, that's the guy who's in charge. You can just tell.
Oh, not just the man in charge, but the man with the plan. Like, even in a movie like Gunfighters, where he doesn't want to resort to violence, like, he comes up with so many diplomatic ways of working through his situation. And when the rubber hits the road, like, he doesn't hesitate. he's got so many qualities that are just admirable in a human being in those roles that, of course, he's going to be a figure that you admire. How could you not?
Even outside of his, acting and the roles he played, and I think this was true of a lot of Hollywood actors from the early part of the 20th century, but I thought this was amazing that when the U.S. got involved with World War I, he was only 19 years old. He joined the army and actually served in France as an artillery observer to the 2nd Trench Mortar Battalion. Not exactly an easy assignment. And it was his wartime experience that gave him a lot of the experience, including riding a horse and use of firearms. Everything from riding into battle gave him all he needed to ride into the cinema. So he's kind of his own war hero, but he's also he plays a hero, but he's also a real hero.
And he and Cary Grant were like the best of friends. Like they lived together in a beach house, and people would jokingly call it the Bachelor Hall. And they would just hang out all the time, making movies, bringing in different friends and women and all that other stuff. And it just seemed like the best environment to be part of. But, that was back in the 40s.
Now, obviously, in the 1974 audience would have been much more aware of that actor, even than when I was a kid. I think today, most people would not remember Randolph Scott. I mean, he doesn't have that name like John Wayne or Cary Grant, but if anybody just were to take a momentary look at his body of work, I mean, he was huge at the time.
Well, one thing I found interesting about him is 8 out of the first 9 movies that he was in, he was uncredited. And then basically from 1931 on, he was huge. And he worked, from 1928 to, he was in a movie in 2017, but he really kind of retired around 1962 after Ride the High Country. But after those first 8 or 9 movies, he took off and never looked back. And so he
Did you hear the rumor about how he got that first role?
No, I didn't see that.
Apparently, he was out golfing with Howard Hughes.
Oh, gosh.
And it was that connection that got him his first movie role, uncredited as it was.
Wow. See, sometimes it does live up to that adage of who you know, not just what you know.
I mean, if someone did a biopic about Randolph Scott, it would probably feel a lot like the Forrest Gump movie because he was just surrounded by so many notable people.
Yeah, and he did find himself, I guess, in the right place at the right time, too, to get his career underway. Walt, I asked you this question as we get back to the choir singing. I asked, who is the official, we never get a mayor or a commissioner. We always get sort of everyone in the church speaking and exchanging nods and glances. But now I'm starting to think maybe it is Olson Johnson that's in charge, because just after they call out, Randolph Scott, he decides, yes, we'll do that. So he nods over to Howard Johnson as if like, okay, let's do it. And let's then Howard Johnson be the spokesperson. But it's almost like Olson made the decision.
Yeah, I was noticing that dynamic. I guess they are, whether elected or whatever, they're kind of the town's spineless leadership. And they're really the ones that everybody defers to.
Seems like it. We then get that dissolve and we begin a line of long desperados and bad guys. Now let's start off describing, we've got Taggart and Lyle standing behind a seated Hedley Lamarr who's got a book open. Right now, apparently he's not, maybe it's not registration time. They're a little early for their to sign up for their 5K, but they're not yet taking the signatures quite yet. They've got their backs turned to the table. And then we start getting a dolly shot because it's moving across. And we see the first group looks like your typical cowboys, all dressed up. But then all of a sudden we start seeing maybe more of a mountain man. And then just as this minute ends, we see a guy who looks like he might be wearing a World War II German uniform.
Just a little out of place.
It seems a tad anachronistic.
Well, I would say yes for the time, but being that it's a Mel Brooks movie, it's almost like you start the clock at the beginning and go, how long till the Nazi shows up? So,
all right. Well, that's unfortunately where this minute actually ends. But what's great is we've got Rick coming back for the next couple of days to continue down this long line of banditos and what they're up to. So rather than, spending a lot of time on stuff that we're going to talk about on Monday, let's circle back around to the stuff we talked about today. Rick, do you have anything in your notes that we missed for this minute 70?
No, that pretty much covered everything.
Walt, what about you? Anything that we missed?
No, I think we got it. And I'm excited that we are finally into this, one of my favorite scenes of the entire movie. So I'm looking forward to tomorrow.
Oh, you're going to have to wait until Monday. You got to get the whole weekend so you can get caught up.
That's right. I'm sorry. I forgot it was Friday. That's crazy. It's been a very fast week.
Yeah. Well, we've been having a good time this week. We had the Indiana Jones guys in for a few minutes, and we got the Mad Max team in here. I mean, we're surrounded by some of the best and well-known franchises of all time.
Well, that's true. So it really will help fix what you and I do.
It does. It's going to bring some legitimacy to what is an otherwise illegitimate product.
That's right.
Rick, you guys really are doing a fantastic job with the Mad Max series. You've been really plowing your way through the fourth film in the franchise, unless George Miller decides to bring about his rumored trilogy. But Mad Max Fury Road, I've got to do a shout out to you guys. It's phenomenal. I love the way you break down and analyze one of my favorite franchises and probably one of my favorite film heroes. I mean, Max Rockatansky is one of those guys I've loved ever since the original Mad Max. And then I grew up with the horribly American dubbed one before I finally got one with the Australian dub so I could get what they really sounded like. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about your podcast and tell the audience how they can dive into your world of Mad Max?
Yeah, if people are interested in seeing another movie series set in a deserty looking landscape but want a little bit more post-apocalyptic flair, they can go over to our main website, which is madmaxminute.com. There you can find all of seasons 1 through 3. And then if you are on Facebook, just search for Mad Max Minute. You can find our listener page, Mad Max Minute Beyond Microphone. And if you're on Twitter, you can find us by searching for @MadMaxMinute. We also have an Instagram account that I've started using lately, and that's also @MadMaxMinute. We try very hard to be super branded so that way, no matter where you look, it's Mad Max Minute.
It's fantastic. Folks, you need to sign up, subscribe, get in there, and go catch up. And Rick, take a second, because the way you've set up your podcast, if you're an iTunes user or Apple Podcasts, you might not see all of the original first couple of seasons. So where can people go to make sure they can get started from the very beginning, each and every episode?
That is correct. So we are using Squarespace to host our podcast, and Squarespace is so helpful in that they only provide the first 100 entries in your blog, and anything after that is archived. And so if you go to madmaxminute.com, there's a little link up at the top of the page that says listen now. That'll take you to the most recent episodes. But if you scroll down about halfway down the page, you have all of the album art for each of the seasons we've done. Click on whichever movie you want to start watching, and it'll take you right to minute 1.
It's well worth doing, folks. It is fantastic, even if you're a casual fan. But some of the guests you get, and I will have to say, if you haven't even listened to this season, Mad Max Fury Road, to get the storyboard artist that's been a longtime friend of George Miller for episode 1, I mean, you set the stage for how a podcast should be done. So well done to you and your wife.
Well, thank you.
Walt, where can people learn a little bit more about our show? I mean, we did a season before our show. Maybe they're not as big into Blazing Saddles, but this is our second season.
Well, you're right. And you can go out to just about any podcatcher, including the purple Apple podcast icon. I think I'm getting closer to getting that name right. Stitcher, Premium, Himalaya, all the other great podcatchers. And you can hear season 1, which was Young Frankenstein. We covered 106 minutes, and Rick and his wife Julia joined us for part of that. And there were some fantastic scenes in that movie that you really want to catch up on. And then, of course, you can find us on our website at thewilderride.com.
And come back on Monday. Go back, binge, tell your friends, join our listeners group. But whatever you do, come back Monday for minute 71, where we continue to look at a bunch of World War II Nazis as part of this lineup. You know, some hooligans and desperados. And we're going to end on the line rape, murder, arson, and rape. To find out what happens all in between the beginning and the end, you've got to come back Monday for this, The Wilder Ride.
Is this where we invoke the name of Randolph Scott?
Randolph Scott.
Randolph Scott.
I'd do it for Randolph Scott. I'm not sure what it is, but I'd do it.
Well, I think...
See, that's the thing. It doesn't matter what he asks. You're going to do it because it's Randolph Scott.
It is.
That's right. I think Randolph
Scott
Scott wants everybody to go to our Facebook page and join our listeners group.
Is he like the grandfather to Montgomery Scott? Because he could always get things done. Hey.
Montgomery Scott. Yeah, I think they are.
That doesn't have the same ring to it, does it?
Wait, too many syllables.
Not when I'm
work.
singing it.
And this season, we are diving into Young Frankenstein. No, geez, we are not diving into Young Frankenstein. What the?
When I said if it was easy, everybody was doing it. Or when I said it was easy, okay, third time's the charm.